Morning again, good morning. Now it's one of the highlights of the festival, Chris Rainier. Actually, we could run a Nordic Light Festival with only Chris. He's an amazing guy and so generous of you to visit us because you are traveling all the time. So it's fantastic that you take time to be here. We're going to meet in Tokyo in next month. Or
June.
Yeah, in June, yeah.
Fantastic.
And first of all, this is the third visit that Chris has here. He's amazing photographer, amazing guy, and I'm just thrilled that you're here. A friend of the festival.
And a friend together.
Yeah.
Exactly. We were in Bangladesh in January, and over a very good bottle of wine hatched the idea of having this conversation. So thank you indeed for having me. Thank you. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be back again. I don't know how many people have seen the last couple lectures, so I don't want to go over old material, and I kind of wanted to go in a very new, different direction. I have a book out, and we'll be talking a little bit about that at the very end. But and the book is a retrospective, and I think you get to a certain point in your life as an artist. I'm 55, where you've created a body of work, and you begin to really kind of reflect on not only your successes, not only some of the things that have happened in your life, but the failures. And I think today what I'd love to do is share with you some of the influences that I've had on my career, both in photography and outside, and some of the failures and hesitations and reflections and changes in direction. And I think for any artist to be honest, or to be a really sincere artist, they need to be vulnerable, they need to be willing to make mistakes as they continue in their career. I remember seeing an interview with, I think it was the musician Neil Young, and he said the hardest thing with success is to continue to put yourself in a position where failure is a possibility, therefore growth is inevitable. And I think that is for all of us, regardless of the point we are in our artistic evolution, is that willingness to reinvent yourself. Last time I was here, I did a lecture on Ansel Adams. He's been a profound influence on me. And as much as his photography, and certainly being in the darkroom with him, was a powerful experience, it was picking up little nuggets of information from him along the way. I worked with him in the last 5 years of his life. We were right in the middle of doing a whole sort of review of his images for his autobiography. So at that point, years just imminently away from his death, he knew that he wanted to kind of make his mark, do his autobiography. So he was very much in this sort of mindset of deep philosophy. And as a 19-year-old at that point, fresh out of art school, it was a profoundly beautiful, powerful, inspirational experience. But what I got from him was many things. But on his deathbed, literally the night he was about to pass away, he knew this. He knew that this was the moment. He said, "Where has all the time gone? I'm only just beginning." And here's an artist that had over 100 one-man shows around the world, had 15 honorary degrees, had been honored by kings and queens. The President of the United States had given him the Freedom Medal. So clearly he achieved a lot, but had barely started. And that really set me into motion at that age as an artist that click, the clock is ticking. And for all of you that are artists and photographers, I suggest you realize this is not a dress rehearsal. This is the real thing. This is your moment. And I've had many mentors along the way that I'm so grateful of that have really inspired me to take the risks and go for it. Another great thing that Ansel Adams said to me was put off short-term gains for long-term goals. In a culture, in a society that is deeply embedded in instant gratification, the notion of working towards something that you may not achieve potentially in this lifetime if you're a Buddhist, but certainly as an artist, is a foreign concept. And I think that was a real nugget of information that allowed me to set some goals as an artist that I may not see until I was 40 or 45, or for me at 55, I haven't achieved yet. And I think that's something that is something to think about. So Ansel inspired me on many levels. Obviously, technically, I learned a tremendous amount in the darkroom. His favorite phrase was not that one, was the negative was the score, the print was the performance. He was a musician, so he thought constantly in terms of the performance. So if you look at his work and study his work, indeed the negative was wonderful, but his magic was the print and the performance. And I think for me that also really inspired me in terms of creativity and the amount of work that I put in prints. I also was very inspired by his non-landscape photographs. He photographed the American West, therefore a lot of the Native Americans and Native American cultures at that time. And coming from the background that I had as someone who was raised overseas, my father is South African, I grew up in Australia and the Middle East and South Africa, my reference was culture, but culture within the landscape. So I was inspired by the iconic images that he had created. Also, at that period of time, he lived in California. What little free time I had, I would often go to the Southwest desert of the United States. Spiritual landscape, powerful place to see where culture still exists. I also was very inspired by his color work, and there's not much known about his color work. Part of what I did when I worked for him, he had 50,000 negatives, is that we dove in and we made proof prints of all of the negatives that had never been printed. We discovered a whole cache of probably about 1,000 color 8x10 chromes. So at the time that he was doing many of his classic images in 1940, 1950, Kodak was developing early Kodachrome, early Ektachrome, and shipping him batches of this new film that they had just created with an ASA, or ISO, we call it now, of 5 or 10. Very slow film. So at the same time he was photographing his classic images, he was photographing and doing color. And I discovered that within sort of a box somewhere, and it ended up being a book done after he had passed away. But that parallel universe of doing black and white and color at the same time really inspired me too, and really, as I'll show you, is a reflection of the kind of journey that I took throughout my life, studying the zone system, studying black and white, having a passion and I think inevitable love and priority for black and white, but shooting color also and seeing the difference. And for me, color is a very, very powerful medium. During the period of time of working with Ansel, Georgia O'Keeffe, the famous American painter, was a dear friend, so inevitably spent a lot of time with her. And I was incredibly blown away and inspired by this iconic, powerful woman who was married to Alfred Stieglitz. They had a very strange, wonderful relationship, and indeed had the opportunity to travel with her and Ansel in the Southwest desert to where she lived, and to come to discover within Ansel's negatives that he was very profoundly inspired by her work. And there's a lot of clear examples in his photographic experimentation where he indeed sort of almost copied Georgia O'Keeffe in black and white and color. So very inspired by her symbolism, her simplicity, the sort of Zen approach she had to the landscape. I remember one day, Ansel had this big, huge white Cadillac. We're driving around in the Southwest desert, and I look in the rearview mirror, and there's Georgia and Ansel talking about Alfred Stieglitz, and I just pinched myself, and I realized, holy shit, I am sitting with the two great American iconic artists that are having a little jam session in the back, and I realized how important their work was in the evolution of art, certainly in the United States during the 20th century. During that period of time, I also had the opportunity to meet many great photographers that sort of had a pilgrimages to Ansel's door and would meet with him. And also at that time, there was an organization called the Friends of Photography, and they were based in Carmel. They had been started by Ansel and Weston and a number of photographers, and it became a workshop scenario. So I really got my PhD during that 5-year period of constant flow of photographers coming through, very much like what we have here at the festival. And that's why I continue to come back to this festival, because of your great efforts. Clearly the world's top photographers end up having a pilgrimage here, and it's a constant level of education and enlightenment and inspiration. And so that's what I was going through at that early stage in my career. People like Richard Michalak, who was doing contemporary landscapes in a very, very new way with the palette of color. And I began to understand the deep, deep psychology of color, and really, in a way, have been grappling with that my entire career, because I think a lot of photographers just shoot color and aren't aware of the psychology, the deep psychology of color and the psychology of what it does in our brain. So Richard Michalak's work, Paul Capronegro was a dear friend of Ansel's. If you know his work, he was a student of Minor White, a profoundly important, profoundly spiritual photographer. And for me, that was a real eye-opener in terms of being able to meld art with social cause. Ansel Adams did a lot of social documentary work for the conservation of the national parks in the United States. So the idea of having photojournalism or documentary work, art, and spiritualism all come together was something that I was trying to come to terms with. So many of these photographers kind of added to the brew in my internal evolution as an artist of how I could pull that all off. And I think in one form or another, I suspect many of you as artists and photographers are dealing with how to put things together, and also that real essence of how you make a living from photography. And Ansel would often talk about assignments from within and assignments from outside. And so separating those two sometimes can be very relaxing and empowering, because if you figure out a way how to make a living from photography but separate your own personal work, and if you're lucky enough you can combine the two, but many of us have to kind of do those types of things to be able to have our own personal work. So again, that journey was a process that I was going through at that time as well. Another amazing photographer that came into my being at that point was a student of Paul Capronegro's, and she's gone on to be a highly respected photographer. She teaches at San Francisco Arts Institute, Linda Connor, and she does very, very beautiful work. She'd be a fantastic person to bring, and her work is just deeply spiritual, a lot of social documentation of cultures going. Mary Ellen Mark, I know you've had her here, so I was also kind of beginning to figure out how I could do the social documentary work, but yet deal with it in an art form. And Mary Ellen came through. She came through just at the time when her Mother Teresa work was being published. It had just been published in Life magazine, and the Friends of Photography did a book on her work, and her whole existence really, really blew me away. I think her work is some of the most important, iconic documentary work done in our lifetime. And, haven't seen much work from her recently, but she just continues to really kind of move into that environmental portrait. And that's an area that I kind of began to explore as much as possible. Another photographer that you don't know much about, but is very, very important in the evolution of street photography and color street photography, which Alex Webb is very much in that genre, is Raghubar Singh. Indian photographer, and profoundly important in terms of the history of photography, really considered sort of the color Cartier-Bresson along with Alex, in terms of the complexity of imagery all coming together at the same time, and the color palette, something that we all grapple with as street photographers and documentary photographers. And then, someone who was well dead by the time I was alive, Edward Curtis. Photographed the Native American culture at the turn of the 20th century, really very controversial in the field of photography and photo criticism, because he set up images and was criticized for that. But it's really very important to realize that his work stands as an archive, as a documentation of a culture that no longer exists. And for me, that was very inspiring, and it's also been very nice for me to see very recently there was a book published, yet another book published on his work, and it really speaks of, at the end of the book, the beauty of his work as an archive for the cultures themselves. So I'm doing a lot of projects within the Native American communities now. Every school I go to, every immersion school I go to, there are Edward Curtis images, and they're using those images to actually revitalize dances and traditions and rituals that have gone extinct. And I think for me, that is what I love about photography, and what I do in terms of documenting culture is that there is the power of photography, almost like a postcard to the future, to be able to be an archive for indigenous groups that have lost their traditions and are seeking to go back to it. Photography plays a very important role, not only in terms of social documentary in the present tense, but also as an archive into the future tense. And as we create billions of pixels and we're trying to figure out where we put all of our information and how do we have it last, one of the important things you should be considering about it is archiving your work. Where does it exist? And where will it exist for future generations? And that's a part of the two-day seminar that we're involved in, the Pixel project that's going on, and is still going on as we speak, is how do we deal with all this information? How do we conceive of our website as an archive? How do we deal with longevity of images? So, jumping into my work, at that period of time, early 1980s, spending a lot of time in the American Southwest, this is Colorado, Arizona, Utah, seeking spiritual landscapes, discovering the Native American culture, finding embedded in a lot of these canyons and cave walls, symbols, iconic spiritual symbols that I would see repeated again and again as I've traveled around the world for the last 35 years. And indeed, the minute I finished working at Ansel studio, for me, the very next day I was on the plane and took off, and I literally have not stopped that journey since. And that was basically in 1985, and I spend probably 7 months of the year on the road, and really have for me, a kind of race against time. For me, I'm trying to photograph cultures that live in the present, that are from the past, for future generations. Again, creating that archive that will be used by future generations. One of the first places I went to was India. This is one of the first images that I took for me that was a passageway. And we often, as artists, evolve and have a tremendous amount of failures. And I seek failures because when I'm failing, I know I'm striving for something beyond the plateau that I'm in. It's easy to arrive at a plateau. It's easy to repeat yourself. It's certainly once you've started having success, it's easy just to kind of play that game out. But there are these moments where you're not conscious of it until you click the shutter and you know you're someone different as an artist once you've taken that image. And this, for me, was it. Group of nuns wandering down the hallway. I saw the shoes. I knew there was something that was going to evolve. I set up the tripod, had a moment just to do a slow shutter speed, about a second, as they came out. And for me, that was the first time I had taken an image like that. That was the first time I had taken it from the literal into the suggestive, into something that Minor White would often talk about in terms of the spiritual, beyond the obvious. And that was a turning point for me. This image was also a turning point for me several years later in Tibet, coming across a symbol. And I think for me, travel is all about reserving judgment. We as humans are ethnocentric. We know our own culture, but when we deal with other cultures, we have prejudice, we have pre-visualization or expectations. And I think for me, travel is all about going into a culture, reserving judgment, being open, and in the end, learning to ask the right questions. We ask the wrong questions based upon our own culture and our own reference point. Take, for example, this symbol, a very charged symbol in the 20th, now into the 21st century. In fact, the Hindu word for this symbol is swastika, but it's the 4 elements of life, those 4 dots, earth, wind, fire, sky, one of the most sacred symbols for most cultures around the world, including also some animistic, non-formal religion spiritual groups that use this symbol as well. It's a very iconic symbol. I saw it in the Southwest Desert. I've seen it repeated over and over again in different parts of the world. Certainly very strong for Hindu, Buddhism, many other types of cultures. Very powerful. I saw this taking Ansel Adams' whole concept of pre-visualization, which is eventually as you begin to evolve and run several thousand million pixels through your cameras, that you begin to have almost like this déjà vu experience whenever you set up your camera in a place where an image that you know is about to be unfolding, is that you have this pre-visualization. You can see exactly the finished print. And so for me, I turned the corner, saw that, knew that something was going to happen, knew that I had pre-visualized it, and this event sort of was an affirmation of that. Minor White was a great photo poet, and he would often say that slow down until the object of your attention affirms your presence. And that's in a spiritual sense too, not so much slowing down, but in your evolution as an artist, slow down. Be more cognitive and conscious of that process, and then the subject matter and that place you want to go as an artist will reveal itself. It will affirm your presence. Another very powerful experience for me was New Guinea. I spent 10 years of my life living in New Guinea for half of the year. New Guinea is the island just north of Australia, and truly a Stone Age culture. Places, valleys in this island still have not had contact with the outside world. It's one of the few places left on the planet. And for me, it's great to know that there are places still out there beyond the edge of the map where there are societies like this. There are civilizations, there are groups, that we haven't Google Earthed the entire world, that there are magic. There's still magic out there that can't be quantified. And so just going back to this image, I wanted to photograph a young initiate's ritual, his initiation ritual. I had come up that valley, up to the top of the mountain. Sitting at the top of the mountain was an elder, and as I sat down beside him to rest, through the translator, he said to me, "Which valley are you from?" Because in New Guinea, they are so isolated, they literally don't go out of their valleys. There's over 1,000 languages, not dialects, languages in the island of New Guinea alone. So they literally do not journey out of their particular valley. So he was curious, this white person, "Which valley are you from?" And I kept smiling, "No, no, no, many valleys away." And he kept persisting, "No, which valley are you from?" And then he thought for a moment, looked up at the sky, and then he said, "I know. You're from where the green meets the blue." He had heard of this place, the color of the sky, when the land ended, turned into blue. And of course, that was the ocean. And I wrote that down in my journal, and in a way, we're all from where the green meets the blue. We're from this small, fragile planet, Earth and ocean together. And it was very symbolic, and I wrote that down, and it still continues to resonate in my head. During that period of experience, we had isolated a potential area where there were some tribes that had not had contact before. And so, obviously, as an explorer, that was something that I really wanted to do, to have that powerful experience, as if going to another planet, coming over, cresting the hill into another existence, another way of life. into the Garden of Eden, so to speak. So we found this particular tribe. Indeed, they had not had contact. We spent about 10 days there photographing them, trading stories, talking to them through translators. And then on the very last day, I'm sitting there. I'd packed away my equipment. My camera was in my bag. I was writing in a journal. A storm broke out. They brought out these wonderful rattan raincoats. The storm passed, cleared, beautiful sunset. Sitting there enjoying the moment, and I looked up in the sky, and some 30,000 feet above me was a jet streaming, probably on its way from Australia to Thailand or Cambodia or China. And it struck me, what an amazing moment to be alive in the 21st century, where you still have places like that on the map, and yet we have all of this technology. We have the ability to stream. People in other parts of the world may be potentially listening to this very lecture. We can email. We can have smartphones in the middle of the New Guinea jungles. We can have cyber cafes in Timbuktu. What an amazing moment for all of us, to be alive at this moment, because this will not exist in another 50 years. And I think we will have lost a deep element of our souls. Very powerful experience for me. Another one was in New Guinea. I was at that time working for Time magazine as a contract war photographer, so I lived this parallel, different realities of jumping into Dante's Inferno and then jumping back into the Garden of Eden, the spectrum of life experience. So just before I went in to photograph this Stone Age battle that I had heard was going to unfold, I got a call from Time magazine, please be in Sarajevo in 4 weeks. There's a photographer moving out. We want to replace you with him. I said, sure. Went in, photographed the Stone Age battle, ritualized, bows and arrows, sticks, the whole thing. Came out, and within a week of leaving New Guinea, I was in Sarajevo in the worst part of the Bosnian War. And a couple of days after being there, as I was running for my life and photographing, it struck me, what an amazing, bizarre thing. We have the conceit as a human species that we have evolved into a point where we are sophisticated. But all we have really evolved is the sophistication of our ability to kill each other. Witness Syria at this moment as it unfolds. So indeed, doing this parallel reality. So from about 1985, when I left the Ansel Adams studio, quickly was fascinated with the concept of the human psyche. And I wanted to, as much as I wanted to explore the Garden of Eden and cultures that were untouched, I also wanted to go deep into the psyche and the dark energy, the Damien in each of us as humans. And so I went to the outer edges and I photographed almost every conflict during the late 80s, all through the 90s, and into the early part of this century. Bosnia, Chechnya, Rwanda, Cambodia, Somalia, Sudan, all of those wars, and very, very powerful experiences for me. One of them, of course, was Sarajevo. This is the entrance into Sarajevo, someone dashing across the street as the Serb sniper is tracking her. And you would get off the UN planes at the Sarajevo airport, and hopefully someone would pick you up in what's called a hard car, a protected car, and you would race down the sniper alleys sort of into the citadel of Sarajevo. And as you passed the sort of last chamber, last roadblock, that was the sign that someone had scrolled on the wall, "Welcome to hell." And another powerful experience for me was Somalia in Africa. I covered the civil war there. There was a group of photographers and I that continued over a year to go back in and cover it and try and get some traction to really amplify the story. Up to this point, I had been trained as a photojournalist. I had been trained that objectivity was everything that I had to frame. So if I didn't see it through that 35 millimeter frame, it didn't exist. Objectivity at all cost. Until I had a very powerful experience. One day we were driving along in a Red Cross vehicle, pickup truck, had my camera with me, and shimmering off in the desert was this hut. And as we pulled up, I saw this old man, his son, his only remaining son, his 3 children that had already passed away, and his wife, and they were wrapped up in the traditional Islamic cloth. And I knew something was going to happen. Chance favors the prepared mind. I had my camera, f-stop, speed. I jumped out of the vehicle. As I walked up to him, he reached out of the darkness into the light, into the hope. And I photographed it. We put him in the vehicle. I continued to photograph him, very focused, unemotional, photographing. And then I realized the old man was thirsty. He spoke English. I distinctly remember putting my camera down and offering to take his son and give my bottle of water to the old man. I did so. I was no longer a photographer. I had become a part of the event. And about 10 minutes later, the boy died in my arms. And it shattered my whole world. How could I be objective as a photographer, as a human, and to witness this amount of poverty and sadness and darkness and be objective? There is no such thing as objectivity. As a photographer, you should be passionate. You should be compassionate. You should be passionate. You should roll around in it. You should smell it. You should love it. You should hate it. You should make love to it. You should be a part of that. For me, as the viewer of your images, I want to see your emotions, your point of view, your outrage, your love. So objectivity is a lie. I had a powerful experience once in Africa. I really wanted to go home. Africa, as the scientists have told us, we all came from Africa. The original pilgrimage for man was we stood up and walked out of East Africa. So I wanted to go to East Africa. I wanted to go home. I wanted to walk with the Maasai and my brothers and my relatives and say, what does it feel like to feel that you have been raised in the cradle of mankind? Hired Jackson, Maasai who had been trained in Nairobi, disillusioned with modernity, had come back to his village, and he indeed was my guide for those 5 days. We slept under the stars. We wandered among lions and giraffes and elephants. And on the very last night, he said, "Chris, you've asked me so many questions. I'd love to ask you some questions." I said, "Sure." Around the campfire, he said, "What are your rituals in your culture? What are your initiation rituals? What do you do when your elders are too old to look after the cattle in the fields? And what do you do to look after your land for future generations?" Again, a very powerful moment for me, and I wrote that down. So I have continued to shoot in black and white, and I want to get to the color here. I did a book on ancient marks, on tattooing. I followed the flow of ink around the world for 8 years, documenting many traditional cultures and contemporary cultures. This is a Yakuza woman. She is the head mistress or concubine of the head of the mafia. This image speaks of also perseverance. As a photographer, it took me 5 years to gain permission to get inside the Yakuza. I was denied time and time again. I had a contact. He was a tattoo artist, and eventually he realized I was not going to go away. And it all came together. He said, "Jump on an airplane." I went to Tokyo, and for about 2 weeks I was embedded in with the Yakuza. And once you're accepted within them, you are perfectly safe. I was assigned a bodyguard, looked after. The only time I felt slightly challenged was behind me in this image are 300-pound bodyguards that are like sumo wrestlers that are watching my every move. And when you do something wrong with the Yakuza, how they punish you is make you chop off your own pinky. So far, I haven't ticked them off. But for me, that was a very important element of what I was doing. Again, the landscape, spiritual landscape, going to very spiritual places around the world. This is the Nazca Lines In Peru, these are these amazing patterns that are miles long, scattered across the desert right north of Lima, Peru, in the form of designs as well as iconic animals. The only way you can really photograph it is to get it up into the air and photograph. And I realized, again, getting to black and white and color, that the best way for me to speak of what I wanted to speak of was to shoot it in black and white. Spent a lot of time going to very spiritual, iconic archaeological sites around the world, PowerPoints as I call them. I would often try and get there on the moonrise, the full moon. This is the day after. I had gotten permission to spend the night on the pyramids, photograph the star trails all night, and that was the next morning. And so to begin to kind of jump into color, again, prior to digital, I would have two cameras, a color camera and a black and white camera. Now, of course, with digital, you simply have one camera, and then you create a different file in Photoshop, and this is the evolution for me into color. Shooting it at the same time, not thinking about whether it's color or black and white, just shoot both, or shoot one file and create another file, as I mentioned, and then look at it in the darkroom, the digital darkroom, and decide which is best. So my journey through color. Again, the psychology of color. I'm always afraid of color because it becomes color as content. Color is content. And I'm not wanting to focus on the color. I'm wanting to focus on the message behind the color. I want the color not to distract me or to distract you. I want it to enhance the message. So I'm very much in the process of still getting to know color. Shooting with the new digital cameras, it's such a delight because you can take your ISOs up to 10,000 now, 15,000. There are things that are being done now with the new digital that you couldn't imagine doing 5 or 10 years ago. Petra stumbled across this amazing experience again on a full moon. I snuck into Petra on a full moon, and there was this bizarre ritual going on with 1,000 candles lighting it up. You can see the stars overhead. I'm fascinated with that evening experience. I was asked to be a part of an expedition 4 years ago by a group of the world's elite skydivers. They were going to set a world's record of skydiving over Mount Everest. They wanted someone to photograph it. I had never skydived in my life, and I said, sure. I came along with them. This is the Everest region on a full moon the night before we jumped. Next morning, got up, went in an airplane with oxygen, flew over the top of Mount Everest at 30,000 feet, approximately 1,000 feet above Everest, went downwind 3 miles, and my first dive ever was over Mount Everest, and it was one of the most powerful, profound experiences in my life. I'm interested at that interesting juncture where black and white and color meet. So your rods and your cones in your eyes are not sure if it's black and white, monochromatic, or color. And I'm fascinated with that. Fascinated with the minimalism of color. Spent a lot of time down in Antarctica. I love Antarctica. I think for me, when people say, what's your favorite place to travel to? And I always define it as, are we talking about culture or landscape? And for me, if the question is based upon profound landscapes, it's this place. You can go no further. It is the final frontier on this planet, both poles. And I love Antarctica for the design of the ice, the deep primordialness of the landscape. Also Easter Island, Rapa Nui, again, shooting on a full moon. Love that idea of movement. I think some of the elements in my life that continue to repeat themselves, whether I'm shooting people or landscape, is water, is placing people in water, is the movement, as well as also playing again with that psychology of color and black and white where the two meet. Did a project in the Grand Canyon. I was asked to be a still photographer on an IMAX movie. They were redoing one of their classic documentations of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. So I spent 2 years journeying to the Grand Canyon over and over again to photograph the landscapes and the intimate landscapes there as well. It's a very grand and grandeur-filled place, but I found the most beautiful images were often the small ones, the intimate landscapes that you felt within it. And again, I'm always, as an Ansel Adams protege, trained to understand landscapes. So for me, I think my influences come together, especially when I'm photographing people, of an environment and placing someone into it. So I'm pre-visualizing the concept of looking at the landscape, and then how do I place people into it? How do I do an environmental portrait that contextualizes and speaks to that person? This is a shaman in the Urubamba Valley, right outside of Machu Picchu, and he is giving the sun god the cocoa leaves. And of course, there they chew the cocoa leaves and offer offerings at a very specific time of the year, and that's actually going to be in a week, and I'm flying from here in a roundabout way, and we'll end up in Peru in a week again to do some more documentation of this particular valley up near Machu Picchu in Peru. Kathmandu, again, one of the most spiritual places for me, the gateway to an amazing culture, Nepal and the Buddhist culture. First time I ended up being in the Buddhist culture, I fell in love with it and really kind of made a commitment to become a Buddhist. I'm also fascinated with the Islamic culture, and yet that mystery, that unknown part of it. So for me, again, this image is about clearly it stepping into the culture, but there's an opaqueness. There's a wall there that doesn't allow you to dive deeply into it. Again, Buddhism for me, very, very powerful, both in color and black and white. I do love the psychology of how they play with colors, and indeed the saffron and the red that they work with within their culture. Again, at the moment, I'm shooting both color and black and white. I'll come into the composition, figure out how the psychology of the color works, and then also shoot it in black and white. That narrative is constantly going through my brain. Again, also, New Guinea spent, as I mentioned, 10 years documenting their culture predominantly in black and white. They have a very vibrant use of color. They are all about color. They are all about outrageous color. But for the main project, some of the images that I showed you before, I chose to do black and white because I didn't want color to become the content. And I really kind of caution you as you work with color, if that's your palette of choice, is be aware of why you're interested in color. Movement, another really interesting thing that I love to play with, slow shutter speeds, and yet using the flash fill. So, you shoot the flash and then it's still about a second. So you move the camera after the exposure has begun and you get this great sense of movement, yet the clarity of the shutter. Playing around with that again, this is probably about a second or a 2-second exposure. This is a ritual that only happens at night in New Guinea. Shot it a lot in black and white, but was playing around with the color as well. Flash, and then blurred the camera for about a second afterwards. And again, with the new digital cameras, the ability to be able to shoot well past where traditional film simply wouldn't work. This is a group of San Bushmen in Botswana. Dusk, the sun has been down for probably half an hour. They're around the fireplace, again playing with the psychology of color, warm and cool colors combining. Same thing here. This was in Morocco about 2 years ago in the Sahara Desert. Went out on an expedition and our guides were just simply sitting around the fire one night. And again, playing with that psychology of color. Composition, for me too, cropping, that outrageous cropping, and what you leave out sometimes is more important than what's in the image. And I think coming from an art background, and I took a lot of design courses, lived in London when I was in high school and went to art school there, that sense of design. And there's an exercise that I often tell my students to do, and I still do it myself, is I take my favorite images from Annie Leibovitz or Sebastião Segaldo or Alex Webb or Steve McCurry, and I take tracing paper and I trace the basic designs within the image, put the books away, put the images away, and line up all the tracing paper. And you begin to see patterns that you, as an artist, are attracted to over and over again. Circles, squares, triangles, rectangles. And do that exercise long enough, and it begins to be kind of like a frame and a grid that your eye pre-visualizes through. Foreground, background, foreground, background, foreground, background. Basic designs, shapes that repeat themselves over and over and over again in our lives as photographers. Part of what I do at the National Geographic, I'm a fellow at the National Geographic Society, is to empower indigenous cultures. I think I've gotten to a point in my life where at 55, I'm very grateful for what has happened for me. My career is not over. It's got a nice trajectory, but it's time to give back. It's time to start helping other people, empowering other people. And so for me, when I was asked to come join the National Geographic Society, it was yes as a photographer, but also to help the society empower other storytellers. And I'm all about storytelling. Photography is storytelling. And there are so many cultures, there's so many places on the planet that are doing powerful art, telling amazing stories, and aren't being recognized. So I created a program called the All Roads Photography Program, and I really encourage you on Friday to come see Alejandro's lecture. He was one of our recipients of a grand prize in the All Roads, and he's gone on to have an amazing, amazing career all over the world, and he will be presenting on Friday. We have a number of incredible photographers. I'll show you briefly some of their work here in a moment. But for me, it's all about that act of really kind of giving on to others. I'm reading a book called The Second Half of Life right now, and it's all about how in our culture, the model that we've created by this kind of business model is that you retire and you're sort of shown the off-ramp, and you become irrelevant. And yet in traditional societies for thousands of years, the elders are the wisdom keepers. They are the ones that are given the responsibility of passing on the information. And I think for me that's an interesting notion as I enter supposedly retirement age, is that A, I've only just begun, B, that there is a place for all of us as we move through different stages in our life to have value within society. And so I think as we get to that point, being a wisdom keeper is a beautiful thing. Again, fascinated with that juncture point of where color and black and white meet. I'm doing a whole body of work now on masks. It's about an 8-year project of photographing traditional masks around the world and the rituals around it. And I'm playing a lot with color, shooting color, and then desaturating it right to the edge where it's both color and black and white. Fascinated with that kind of stage. A lot of time in Mustang, which is a province of Nepal, up into Bhutan and into Tibet, also into Mongolia. And I was there last summer, I'll be again there this summer, and also beginning to work with kind of the notion of tilt shift. I love tilt shift. So the act of using cameras, or in Photoshop, there's an ability to work with focus and tilt shift, where you're playing around with the focus. And again, the minimalization of color. These are all tools that, if not used correctly, can become gimmicks. But if you know your mission, you have pre-visualized the statement that you want to make. Or, as Alfred Stieglitz once did, he did a project in the early 20th century called Equivalences. And what he did was photograph a series of clouds, and it was a philosophical definition of what his intention was to have you have the same equivalent experience that he did at the point he took that photograph. So for me, what I'm trying to do is to use all of those tools, whether it's color, whether it's black and white, whether it's tilt shift, whether it's minimal uses of color and black and white. I'm using those as tools to reproduce and have you feel the equivalent the emotional response that I had at the moment that I took it. That, to me, is the power of photography. And we all know that. If any of you just sat in on the Don McCullough lecture, he's one of the great photographers or videos that just showed in this room. He's one of the great war photographers. You look at his images and you had that equivalent emotional response that he did when he was right there in the middle of Dante's Inferno. Or if you look at Joel Peter Whitkin's work, very powerful. You have the same emotional response that he did at the point that he was pre-visualizing that image. That, to me, is a successful image when you can evoke that feeling. These are all these different rituals in West Africa, again, mask rituals around voodoo. Voodoo is very strong and alive in West Africa. I spent about a month there a year ago photographing, going back again, and again, playing around with the color, the black and white. Back into Mongolia, fascinated again with that kind of meeting of color, cool colors, warm colors together. These deer stones arrived in the middle of the day. Yeah, it was an interesting photograph, but I thought, now what can I do to kind of evoke a sense of what this culture would feel like? So I chose to shoot it at night. I took a flashlight. This is actually at dusk, at about 4 in the morning, the moon, first light's beginning to happen, stars are still around, and then I just took a flashlight and painted that. Shamanism is still alive in Mongolia. There's still many shamans functioning there. They have these kind of amazing, iconic spaces, sacred spaces that they work within. And many of the shamans are women, so I worked with this particular woman. There are also a lot of pantomime characters within the shaman spiritualism, photographing them. Buddhism is still very prevalent in Mongolia. It was stamped out for a long period of time when the Russians were in there, but it has really gone through a whole revitalization. So again, getting back to that notion of what it's like to be an elder. And I want to read a quote that I love from, if you know the book, The English Patient, and indeed it's a quote that I have in my book. And I love this quote. It really speaks of who I am and the concept of what the purpose of being on this planet. We die containing a richness of lovers and tribes, tastes that we have swallowed, bodies we have plunged into, and swum up as if rivers of wisdom, characters that we have climbed into as if trees, fears we have hidden as if in caves. I wish for all of this to be marked on my body when I am dead. I believe in such cartography, to be marked by nature, not just to label ourselves on a map like the names of rich men and women on buildings. We are communal histories, communal books. We are not owned or monogamous in our taste or our experience. All I have desired was to walk upon such an earth that had no maps. So part of what I'm really doing now is working with indigenous cultures, working with what I call the last mile. We have this huge experience going on around the planet right now in terms of digitizing the world. We are now becoming truly a global village. We have also now created a new language, the visual language. There are more photographs taken in China every day than the rest, just on smartphones, than the rest of the world takes every day. It is amazing the amount of imagery and visual language that we're creating. Yet there are people that are beyond that are getting left behind in the digital divide. That's who I'm fascinated with making connections with, and where invited, and I repeat, where invited, empower them. So I have a whole program called The Last Mile Technology where we go in and we do training. We're working with the Sherpa community on the shadow of Everest. They are dealing with climate change. Not in the future, right now. They have these huge lakes that are building up that are going to let go at any moment because of the glacial melting. And catastrophically downriver, 10,000, 15,000 people will be swept away like that. They want to be empowered. They want to tell that story. So we're creating these little pockets of places where we bring in solar, we bring in internet connection, we give them storytelling training, simple computers, simple cameras, and we build them a website and create the opportunity for them to tell their own stories. And many, many traditional cultures around the world, because 80% of the world's languages, there's approximately 6,000 languages on the planet, 80% of them are oral. So when that elder dies, a whole library of knowledge goes away. And so what we're doing is we're invited for the groups that are saying, wait a minute, we're about to lose all this intellectual knowledge. We go in and we create opportunities for them to document their languages and their traditions and their myths and put it up on the web and use the internet as a form of archive and as a form of creating opportunities for people to share those stories around the world. Now, Steve McCurry, you're going to meet him later in the week, truly one of the great, amazing photographers of our lifetime. But he's a part of a tradition that I also belong to, working for an institution where white males get sent around the world to tell other people's stories. That's a great notion. What I believe in is that there are also other people, the people themselves, that can tell their own stories. What about if there was an Afghani girl that had a camera? And in fact, you had her here last year, Farzana. She was one of the recipients of one of our Roads programs. So I'm not saying either or, stop sending Steve McCurry around the world. No, I'm merely saying let's add another chair to the dialogue. And that's what the digital medium can do. And indeed, that's what it's doing around the world, is flattening the planet in a way, creating opportunities for other people to share their stories. So Farzana's work has gone on, and she has really become an amazing photographer. And we have a number of fantastic photographers. Nusha went on and started working for the New York Times, Newsweek, Time Magazine, had an exhibit at the UN. Tenzing Norgay, actually a Nepalese Tibetan living in India. Ayin, an amazing Mongolian herdsman who spends 6 months of the year out documenting his traditional culture and then coming back and making prints of this, almost like a contemporary Edward Curtis, getting the very last amount of documentation. Akutende, photographing in Nigeria, doing amazing work. And again, Alejandro, who's in the audience now, please come see his lecture on Friday. To allow opportunities for everybody so everybody has a seat at the table. So what I'd like to do this morning is kind of wrap up to a quote from my first book called Keepers of the Spirit. So as the chainsaws fell the last trees that hide the first peoples, we're alive at an amazing moment in human evolution. That rich tapestry of human culture, that fabric that is made up of the dazzling array of man's diversity, is at a crucial crossroads. Will we let go and sever that fragile umbilical cord to our primeval past, finding ourselves truly alone without cultural purpose, adrift in a vast sea of space with nowhere to go? Or will we make a different choice? It is my hope that we can all gather around the fireplaces of humanity and continue for generations to tell the stories, what it means to be alive on a planet that has survived the 21st century. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, do you want to continue? So we have a couple chairs here. And
Any questions?
yes, questions.
I have a question. When you thank you for a wonderful lecture. Fantastic. We knew that. When you photographed in Papua New Guinea, did they understand what you were doing?
No.
So how do you approach them? I mean, of course you have a
Exactly.
translator, but how do you do it?
So it's so important. You know, photographers often ask me, what's the key? And I say time. In a culture that moves fast, in a culture that we have attention deficit disorder. I notice in the audience every time I lecture there's people checking their computers.
Yeah.
We can't, time is of the essence. For me, the preciousness is when I step back into these cultures is to have enough time to build trust. I always say the quality of the portrait is in direct proportion to the quality of the relationship. And you take beautiful portraits. You know that you need to have a connection with that person. So how do you do that in a culture that doesn't speak your same language? We in the West have disconnected from nonverbal communication. What I love is going to cultures where I can work with nonverbal communication. Sure, there's a translator right there, but I tell the translator to go away. And it's eye contact, it's body language, it's sitting on the ground, it's working with them in the fields, even before I take the camera out, playing with their kids, building a level of trust that may take a week, 2 weeks, before I even begin my project. And for me, that's what it's about, is stepping out of my linear lifestyle and going into a non-linear period of time and really making a connection.
Do you think it will, did it change the way you worked when you switched to digital? And so maybe they want to look at the screen.
Yes.
So what happens then?
Indeed, I do share the screen. And I'll tell you a funny story. Prior to digital, I came back a year later into the same village, gave them a print, and they looked at it, knew that it was them, looked behind, and you could see them beginning to deal with the concept of two dimensions. It was a beautiful experience.
Yeah, I photographed a woman in Africa that was 99, and I gave her the Polaroid, and she didn't understand anything because she had never seen herself.
Yes.
Incredible, 1990.
It's an incredible experience.
I was very fascinated by the story of you and Ansel Adams and George O'Keeffe. You don't talk bullshit with George O'Keeffe, do you?
She was...
not a small talker.
Not a small talker, and she was the only person that Ansel was really intimidated by. She was sitting around with Virginia Adams, Ansel's wife. I was this is after Ansel had passed away. We're sitting around having breakfast one morning, so there's Virginia, there's Georgia. Everybody's reading their morning newspaper. I'm still going, oh my God, this is George O'Keeffe right here. And she says, you know, reading the obituaries is a great way to keep up on all your old friends. Her sense of humor.
Yeah.
I notice only the older people laugh about this.
Before we close, could you please tell the story of the very generous Ansel Adams, where the two people try to find the moonrise?
We've had
so beautiful story.
We've had so many opportunities to share stories, and he has amazing stories too. So I so enjoy when we get together. But I think it was last time in January when we were together at this conference in Bangladesh. We had a couple bottles of wine. The stories were flowing, and I remembered a story where on a Monday morning I looked outside, and the garbage disposal guys were there, and they were going through Ansel's garbage looking for, man, there's got to be a moonrise around here. Ansel steps out, and the first thing he says, don't go through the garbage. I'll get you a print. Just wait. And just at that point, his secretary, Ansel's secretary, stepped out and said, it's President Carter on the phone, and he wants to talk to you. And Ansel said, tell him I'm busy right now. I'm talking to my friends.
And moonrise was one of the most famous photographs in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Remember, Chris is leaving tomorrow. He has got his book, a few copies. So if you want to buy it, you can sign it. But you cannot wait to Friday if you want it signed. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.